The envelope was red, not a bright, cheerful red the way a Christmas card should be. A darker red, the kind that had sat in a letterbox too long under a December sun that showed no mercy to anything left outside. I was standing on the front veranda of my house on Edmund Street when the postman's van pulled away, and I had the envelope in my hand before I had properly decided to pick it up. The key to my car was already between my fingers. I had been planning to drive to the Central Market before the crowds got too thick, before the pre-Christmas rush made the aisles feel like something you had to survive rather than enjoy. Adelaide in December has a particular quality of heat that I have always found honest, if nothing else. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The asphalto along Edmund Street was doing that thing it does when the temperature climbs past 38, catching the light in a way that makes the whole road look like it is breathing. The sound of cicadas was filling the air from the she oak at the corner of the street. That steady, relentless sound that I had grown up with and that Elspeth had once described as the suburbs talking to themselves. I turned the envelope over. It was from Lachlan, my son's handwriting on the front, my name in his careful architectural print, the kind of handwriting a man develops when he has spent years presenting things to people who judge the presentation before the content. His address in Glenelg North in the top left corner, a stamp slightly crooked, which told me he had licked it and pressed it himself in a hurry rather than passing it to someone at the office to handle. I noticed that. I noticed small things. It was probably the habit of too many quiet years in a house that had lost its loudest voice. I opened the envelope with one finger rather than tearing it, the way Elspeth had always opened things, saving the envelope as if it might be useful for something later. Inside, there was a card, red background, a stylized Christmas tree in white line art, the kind of card that comes in a box of 20 from a newsagent, which was fine. I did not expect elaborate stationery from Lachlan. He was practical about those things. The card said the usual words about the season and good wishes and the new address in Glenelg North, and a time, 6:30 in the evening on the 24th, and a request to bring something for the table if I liked. And then I unfolded the smaller paper that had been tucked inside the card. It was a note written in blue ink, the fine-tipped kind Lachlan used for marking plans at work. 4 folds, smaller than the palm of my hand when it was open. Bring the gifts for everyone and leave before dinner. Nobody wants the old mood at the table. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I read it a third time. The way you read something when the first 2 readings do not produce an explanation for what the words actually mean. But the words were clear. They were perfectly, efficiently clear. My son, who was 35 years old and had been raised in this house on Edmund Street, who had eaten at this table and slept in the bedroom at the end of the hall, and who I had driven to the hospital at 3 in the morning when he was 22 and thought he had broken a rib in a football match that turned out to be a badly bruised one, had written a note in his careful handwriting telling me to come as a delivery man and leave before the meal. Nobody wants the old mood at the table. The old mood. 2 words that contained a verdict without a trial, a summary without an argument, a conclusion drawn by someone who had decided the evidence was not worth examining. I was the old mood, my presence, my way of being in a room, my tendency to remember things out loud, to mention Elspeth's name when something reminded me of her, to sit quietly at a table and feel what I felt without performing something more convenient. These things had been collected over several years and labeled. I was a category now. I was a condition to be managed, like the weather, like a difficult seating arrangement, like a problem with the acoustics of a room. I stood on the veranda for what must have been several minutes. The cicadas kept their counsel. A car went past on Edmund Street, and a woman walking a golden retriever lifted her hand in the vague greeting of neighbors who know each other enough to acknowledge without stopping. I lifted my hand back. The car key was still between my fingers. The Pantone I had planned to buy at the Central Market was still a thought, not a thing, and it would remain a thought for another few minutes while I stood in the particular stillness of a man whose son has just reduced him to a logistical function. I did not call Lachlan. I want to be clear about that, because some people's first instinct in that moment would have been to call, to ask what he meant, to create an opportunity for him to soften the words or to explain them or to take them back. But I had been alive for 57 years, and I understood something about words that are written down rather than spoken. When a person speaks harsh words in the heat of a moment, there is room for the heat to be the explanation. When a person writes something down, folds it into 4 parts, places it inside an envelope, addresses the envelope by hand, and posts it with a stamp, the heat is not the explanation. The cold deliberateness is the explanation. Lachlan had thought about this. He had decided this was the thing to say, and this was how to say it. He had sent it through the mail because he did not want to have to look at my face when I read it. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I placed the note on the kitchen bench beside the jar of eucalyptus honey that Elspeth's sister had sent from a market in Wollonga, and I made a cup of tea that I drank looking out the kitchen window at the back garden, where the old lemon tree was doing what it always did in December, producing more fruit than any 2 people could reasonably use. Then I went to the Central Market. I bought the Pantone. I bought a wheel of aged cheddar. I bought a small jar of preserved figs in brandy syrup from the Italian deli at the far end. I bought a packet of shortbread wrapped in gold foil. I walked the aisles with a basket over my arm the way I had learned to do when Elspeth was alive, because she had always said that the pleasure of a market was in the walking and the choosing, not just the arriving and paying. She had been right about that, as she had been right about most things involving the slowing down to pay attention. On the way home, I stopped at the newsagent on Norwood Parade and bought a roll of brown craft paper and a spool of green ribbon. Narrow ribbon, the kind that curls nicely when you run it across a scissor blade. That afternoon, I wrapped presents. I have to tell you something about those presents because they are the heart of this story in a way that the red envelope is not. The red envelope was the beginning. The presents were the language I had been learning to speak for the last 3 years without knowing it. Before I tell you about the wrapping, let me tell you about the man I was before that envelope arrived. Because a man cannot be understood only in his worst moment, and he cannot be understood only in his best one. The truth of a person is in the long, ordinary middle. My name is Rowan Fletcher. I am 57 years old. I was born in Adelaide, and I have lived here for my entire life. Not because I was afraid of leaving, but because I genuinely liked it here. The light, the width of the streets, the particular way the city sits between the hills and the sea, and does not seem entirely sure which direction it is facing. I worked for 31 years as a structural engineer, which meant that I spent my professional life thinking about what holds things up. I know a great deal about load-bearing points. I know what happens when a structure is asked to carry more than it was designed to carry without any changes being made to support it. I retired at 55 when the consultancy I had built with 2 colleagues was acquired by a larger firm, and the new arrangements no longer required my particular patience with things that were complicated but not exciting. Elspeth and I were married for 29 years. She was a secondary school teacher of English literature, and she brought to every room she entered a quality of attention that I have never encountered in another person before or since. She did not perform interest. She was simply interested in students who were difficult, in books that other people found tedious, in strangers at dinner parties who had been placed next to her because nobody else wanted to manage them. She could find the interesting thing in any person in under 10 minutes, which meant that she was the kind of woman who made people feel seen. And people who feel seen tend to love the person who saw them. Our two children, Lachlan and Meredith, grew up watching their mother do this, and I believe it shaped them in different ways. Meredith became someone who watched carefully and held back. Lachlan became someone who wanted very much to be seen and was sometimes less able to provide the same to others. Elspeth died at the age of 56. Pancreatic cancer, which is one of those diagnoses that arrives with very little warning and allows very little time for anything except the essential conversations. We had 14 months. I want you to understand that we use those 14 months, as well as two people who love each other can use borrowed time, which is to say imperfectly and gratefully, and with the specific awareness that every ordinary afternoon is not ordinary at all. One of the things Elspeth did in those last months was write letters, not dramatic farewell letters. She would have found those theatrical and somewhat dishonest. She wrote the kind of letter she had always written, noting something specific that a person had done, something she had noticed and valued, something that had made a particular year better than it might have been. She wrote dozens of them. She addressed envelopes in her careful, slanted handwriting and organized them in a wooden box that had originally contained a set of watercolor pencils that she had never used because she was a reader, not a visual artist, but she liked the smell of the wood. Some of those letters she gave to people directly. Some she asked me to deliver. Some she said were for later, when the time felt right. I respected that without always knowing when the time would be right, because Elspeth's sense of timing had always been more accurate than mine. After she was gone, I tried to continue the tradition. Each Christmas, I wrote a letter to each adult member of the family. I was not as elegant as she was. I could not find the same lightness in language that she had possessed naturally, but I tried. The first year, Lachlan read his letter and thanked me and said it was lovely. The second year, he set it aside with the wrapping paper, and I am fairly certain it went into the recycling with the rest of the packaging after the day was over. The third year, he did not mention it at all, and when I asked later if he had read it, he said he had, and that it was nice, which is the word a person uses when they mean it meant nothing. I understand that people grieve differently. I understand that for some people, sentiment is uncomfortable precisely because it costs something to sit with it. Lachlan was not a cold man. He loved his wife. He loved his work. He had built something real in his professional life, and he was proud of it in the way that men of his generation had learned to express pride, through the quality of the house and the quality of the occasion and the precision with which things were arranged. Gemma, his wife, was talented at arrangements. Their home in Glenelg North was genuinely beautiful. She had an eye for the way things looked together, and she applied it to everything, including the guest list and the table settings and, I had come to understand, the atmosphere of the room. I did not fit the atmosphere. I knew this. I had known it for perhaps 2 years before the red envelope arrived. I knew it from the way conversations would shift slightly when I mentioned Elspeth's name. I knew it from the way Lachlan would glance at Gemma when I told a story that took longer than expected. The kind of story that Elspeth would have followed all the way to the end and laughed at in exactly the right place. I knew it from the year that Lachlan did not include Elspeth's name in the Christmas toast, not out of malice, I think, but out of the desire to move forward into a version of the family that was clean and current, and not dragging the weight of an absence that made some people at the table uncomfortable. I said nothing about the toast. I drank my wine. I helped clear the plates. I drove home on the Southern Expressway with the windows down because December nights in Adelaide are warm enough for that, and I sat in the car in the driveway on Edmund Street for several minutes before going inside, because going inside meant going into the quiet. The quiet had become very large after Elspeth left. I had learned to live inside it the way you learn to live inside any climate that is not your natural one. You adapt. You find the small comforts. You develop routines that give the day a shape. Morning tea on the veranda, an evening walk to the end of Norwood Parade and back. Thursday evenings with Noel Hartley, my oldest friend, who would come over with a bottle of something sensible, and we would sit in the back garden under the lemon tree and talk about whatever needed talking about, which sometimes meant Elspeth and sometimes meant cricket, and sometimes meant neither. Just the companionable silence of two men who had known each other long enough to not require words to fill every gap. Noel was 64. He had worked as a secondary school principal for 22 years before his own retirement. And he had the particular combination of warmth and directness that came from spending decades in rooms where someone had to decide what the truth was and say it without cruelty. He had been one of Elspeth's favorite people. He brought flowers to the funeral, and he came back the following Thursday and sat in the garden and cried without apology, and then drank his whiskey and helped me eat half a roast chicken that someone from the neighborhood had left on the doorstep. On the evening after I received the red envelope, I called Noel. Not to read him the note, not to ask his opinion. Just because Thursday was 2 days away and some things are too heavy to carry until Thursday. He answered on the second ring, as he always did. I told him I would be having Christmas alone this year. There was a pause. Then he said he had a leg of lamb and nowhere particular to be on the 25th. I told him that sounded like an arrangement. I did not tell him about the note until later, and by later, I mean in the new year, sitting in the same garden under the same lemon tree, when enough time had passed for the story to have a shape instead of just a wound. But on that December afternoon, with the craft paper on the kitchen table and the green ribbon and the small objects I was choosing with more care than I had chosen almost anything in 3 years, I was not yet thinking about the shape. I was thinking about each person, one at a time, who they were, what I knew about them that perhaps they did not know I had noticed. That is the thing about being the quieter person in a room full of people who are performing themselves for each other. You see more than you are given credit for. Let me tell you about the first present I wrapped. For Lachlan, I found the old bottle opener. It was a wooden-handled thing, nothing expensive, the kind you buy from a hardware store to take camping. I had given it to him as a small addition to a housewarming gift years earlier, when he had bought his first apartment in Prospect. He had made a joke about it being the most useful thing he had received. He had used it at his first barbecue in that apartment. I remembered the afternoon clearly, a warm March day. Elspeth in a pale yellow dress standing on the small balcony. Lachlan grilling sausages with the particular pride of a man inaugurating his first own outdoor space. I had stood next to him, and he had passed me the first beer opened with that wooden handle and said quietly, in a moment where nobody else could hear, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I mean, everything." I had not forgotten that afternoon. I did not think Lachlan had forgotten it either. not entirely, though 3 years of building a more elaborate life had pushed it to a place where it was not easily accessed. I wrapped the bottle opener in craft paper. I cut a length of green ribbon and curled it over the scissor blade. I wrote a card. The card said, in the cleanest language I could find, a man can build a beautiful table and still forget who held the board when it was about to fall. This bottle opened the first beer at your first home on a day when you told me something I have never stopped caring. I thought you should have it back. I signed it with an R, just an R. I set the package on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then I began on the next one. There is a particular quality of silence in a house the morning after you have decided something important. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a house that has absorbed a choice and is waiting to see what you do with it. Edmund Street was quiet in the early hours. The cicadas had finished their night shift, and the birds had not yet begun. I had been awake since before 5, sitting in the chair by the front window with a cup of tea gone cold, going over the list of names in my mind, one by one, each person a distinct weight. I want to go back further now, the way rivers go back to their source when you trace them upstream, because the red envelope did not come from nowhere. It came from years. It came from a family that had been slowly rearranging itself around an absence, and the rearrangement had required certain things to be moved aside, and one of the things that had been moved aside was me. Elspeth and I had come to Adelaide from different starting points. She grew up in a small town in the mid-north of South Australia, in a stone house on a property that ran cattle, the youngest of 3 daughters of a man who read widely and a woman who cooked everything from scratch and considered waste a form of ingratitude. She arrived in Adelaide at 18 to study English at the university, and she never quite left, though the mid-north was always in her somewhere, in her directness, in her ease with silence, in the particular way she could stand in a paddock or a garden and not need anything to be happening. I had grown up in Norwood, in a narrow terrace house not far from the house I live in now, in a family where money was always present enough to be unworrying, but never present enough to become a conversation. My father was a site supervisor for a construction company, and he spent his working life on buildings that he would later point to from car windows with a combination of pride and modesty. That one there was mine, which meant something specific and dignified about his relationship with the things he helped to make. I became an engineer partly because of watching him, the way he read structures, the way he walked a site with the particular attention of someone who understood that the space between things was as important as the things themselves. Elspeth and I met at a party at the university, which I was attending in a companion capacity for a friend who had been invited and did not want to go alone. I was 23. She was 22. She was standing near a window with a book that she had brought to the party because she had not expected to enjoy it and had wanted a contingency. And I had made a remark about the cover that was only moderately intelligent, and she had smiled in the specific way that people smile when they are deciding whether a person is worth their time. And then she had said something about the book that made me understand I was going to have to think more carefully about what I said next. We were married at 27 and 26. We had Meredith first, and then Lachlan 4 years later. And the house on Edmund Street was the house we bought when Meredith was 2, and the terrace we had been renting was no longer suitable for the version of our family we were becoming. The house was modest by almost any measure. 3 bedrooms, a front veranda with a flaking iron railing that I painted every few years, a back garden with the lemon tree that had been there when we arrived, and that I had never had the heart to remove even when it became more tree than practical object. It was the house where Meredith learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway, and where Lachlan had his 12th birthday party in the back garden, and where Elspeth marked the doorframe of the hallway every 6 months until the children were taller than she was, at which point she declared the measurement exercise complete and the pencil marks became permanent features of the house that I have never painted over. They are still there. I see them every morning when I come down the hall from the bedroom. The children grew as children do, in the particular mix of gradual and sudden that parents are never quite prepared for. Meredith was cautious and observant from early on. She had her mother's quality of attention without always knowing what to do with what she saw. She had married Simon Shaw, a man who worked in insurance and who had a dry, careful humor that took some time to appreciate but was genuine once you found it. They lived in Prospect, not far from my old neighborhood, and Meredith gardened on weekends and read the same kind of books her mother had loved and kept a civil but careful distance from conflict, which was both her strength and, in the year of the red envelope, her most costly characteristic. Lachlan had grown into a man who built things in the way I had built things, but with a different aesthetic. Where I had been interested in the invisible architecture, the load paths and the connections, and the things that held without being seen, Lachlan was interested in the surfaces, the finish, the impression. This was not a criticism. It was simply a difference in what gave each of us satisfaction. He had done well in property development. He had an eye for what would sell and a willingness to work the hours required by that ambition. Gemma had come into his life at 30, and she had matched his ambition with her own particular talent, which was the management of environments, physical and social, so that they communicated the right things to the right people. I liked Gemma. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to construct a version of this story where she is simply the person who changed my son, and that would be both unfair and inaccurate. She was not unkind to me in any direct way. She was professionally warm, which is different from personally warm but is not the same as cold. She hosted with skill. She remembered that I did not eat shellfish. She would ask about my work when I still had work, and later about my walks and my projects in the garden, with the attentive politeness of a person performing social fluency, which she had genuinely mastered. But she was not at ease with grief. I had come to understand this as simply the fact of her, the way some people are not at ease with heights or small spaces. Elspeth's death had created a presence in the family that Gemma could not quite manage, the way a room with an unusual corner is harder to furnish elegantly. Elspeth's name was a piece of furniture that did not fit the room Gemma was trying to design. And over time, through a series of small, individually defensible choices, the name had been moved to the edges, and then further toward the edges, and then eventually to the point where mentioning it felt like bringing in something from outside that would leave mud on the carpet. The first time I noticed this adjustment was at the Christmas 2 years after Elspeth died. Lachlan had proposed that year that the family gather at his house rather than mine, which was reasonable. My house was associated for everyone who had loved Elspeth with her absence in a particular and specific way. I understood that some people found this difficult. I agreed without argument. The Sia was elegant. Gemma had found a caterer who did an extraordinary cold seafood spread and a pavlova that was architecturally impressive, a tall meringue structure decorated with passion fruit and kiwi and berries. The table was set with linen napkins and there were candles despite the December heat. It was beautiful. I sat at the table and felt grateful for the beauty even while I felt the particular strangeness of Christmas in a room where the person most associated with Christmas in my mind was visibly not present even in the toasts. Lachlan raised his glass and said something about the year, about new beginnings, about the people gathered in the room. He said Gemma's name. He said Meredith's and Simon's. He said my name. He said nothing about his mother. I held my glass and waited a moment to see if he would add something. He did not. He drank. Everyone drank. I drank. Meredith looked at me from across the table. Just a look. I gave her a small nod that meant I am fine, and also meant I noticed, and also meant let us not make this the thing right now. She nodded back in a way that meant she heard all three things. After dinner, when Gemma was in the kitchen with the plates and Lachlan was pouring cognac for Simon, and the evening had relaxed into its after-dinner softness, I walked out onto the back deck of the Glenelg North house and stood in the warm air looking out at the suburb. There was a smell of barbecue from a neighboring property and the sound of someone's Christmas music. Something with guitar. Something Australian drifting over the fence. I thought about Elspeth. I thought about what she would have said at that table, what toast she would have made, how she would have made each person at the table feel like the most interesting person in the room by the time dessert arrived. I did not cry on the deck. I had learned, by that point, to find a different place for that. I went home after the cognac and I sat in the garden under the lemon tree and I let myself feel what the evening had cost. That was 2 years before the red envelope, 2 years of small adjustments, 2 years of being the person who arrived on time and helped with the chairs and did not mention the elephant in the room because the elephant's name was a woman I had loved for 29 years and her name was making certain people uncomfortable. Noel had warned me, in his careful way, that there was a difference between keeping peace and becoming invisible. He had said this the way he said difficult things, gently, but without softening the substance. He had said it after the second Christmas, sitting in the garden with his whiskey. I had told him about the toast. He had listened and then said that. I had told him I understood. I had told him I was choosing my battles. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said that the problem with choosing not to fight was that sometimes the other side didn't know there was a battle at all. I had thought about that for weeks. I was still thinking about it on the afternoon I was wrapping presents in brown craft paper with green ribbon. Let me tell you about Meredith's present, because Meredith's was the one that required the most honesty from me, and honesty is harder when it involves someone you love and understand. Meredith was 38. She was careful, as I said. She was the kind of person who saw the truth of a situation clearly, and then looked around for the way to navigate it that caused the least disruption. This had served her well in many contexts. In a family where the disruption involved her father's gradual erasure from the Christmas table, it had not served anyone particularly well. I found an old notebook in the study. It was one I had never used. A good quality one, a dark blue cloth cover, a gift from a colleague at the firm some years back. I wrote on the first page in my best handwriting. I wrote something that took me 3 drafts to get right. The notebook says, "Neutrality is a kind of language. It speaks very clearly to the person who needed a voice. I have never blamed you for choosing the path that caused least friction. I know that path costs more than it looks like from the outside. This notebook is for any year you decide to write a letter. There is no deadline. There is no pressure. But if you ever want to say what you actually saw, there is now a place to put it. I signed it R. I wrapped it in the craft paper. I curled the ribbon. For Simon, the bottle opener had already been chosen. No, that was Lachlan's. For Simon, I had found the old tape measure. It was a Stanley, the kind with a clip for a belt loop, the model that had been standard on every site I ever worked. I had given Simon one years ago when he and Meredith had bought their house in Prospect, and he had spent a weekend trying to figure out where to put shelves and had borrowed mine repeatedly before I had simply bought him one. He had used it constantly for 2 years. He had taken it when they moved, and at some point it had been lost in the chaos of a renovation, and he had never replaced it. He had mentioned this to me casually, the way people mention small losses, not expecting them to be remembered. I had remembered. I bought a new one of the same model. I wrapped it. I wrote a card that said, "You measured every wall of that house, which means you know exactly what fits and what does not. Thank you for being someone who always knew which repairs to make and then made them without waiting to be asked. I have always appreciated that about you." Our Gemma's present had taken me the longest to decide. Not because I was uncertain about Gemma, but because I was uncertain about what I wanted to give her, what I wanted her to receive. The wrong thing would have been a lesson, and I did not want to give lessons. The wrong thing would have been an accusation, and I did not want to make accusations. What I wanted was something that would be true, something that was simply, cleanly, entirely true. I found the tuwalha in the cedar chest in the back bedroom. It was one of Elspeth's embroidered ones, a small rectangular piece of white linen with a border of pale blue flowers, worked in a style that was old-fashioned without being fussy. Elspeth had made several of these in the years before her diagnosis, during a period when she had taken up needlework as a practice of patience. She had given many of them away. This one she had set aside, and when I asked her once why she had not given it to anyone, she had said she was waiting for the right occasion. I had wondered, in the years since, what the right occasion would have looked like to her. Going through her letters after she died, I found one that had been addressed to Gemma but never sent. Not because it was harsh, because Elspeth had written it during a period when Gemma was going through a difficult time in the first year of her marriage to Lachlan, a period when several members of the family had expressed quiet reservations about whether she was the right fit for him, whether she was warm enough, whether she understood what the Fletcher family valued. These reservations had been expressed carefully and privately, but in the way that private reservations travel within families, they had eventually reached Gemma in the form of a slightly cool reception at a gathering. Elspeth's unsent letter to Gemma said, "I want you to know that I have seen you, and I have seen someone who is trying very hard to belong somewhere that has not yet made room for her. I do not agree with the judgments being made in quiet corners of this family. I think you are more than adequate. I think, in time, you will be more than adequate, and I want to say this to you clearly because nobody else seems to be saying it, and people who are trying deserve to hear something true once in a while." She had never sent it. Perhaps because the moment passed. Perhaps because she thought Gemma had found her footing without needing the letter. Perhaps because the right occasion for giving it had not yet arrived. I folded the letter carefully. I wrapped the tuwalha around it in a small bundle. I placed the bundle in a box and wrapped the box in craft paper and tied the green ribbon. I wrote a card. The card said, "She wrote this and chose not to send it. I'm not sure why, but she kept it," which I think meant something. This was hers, and it should now be yours. Our Patricia Wells, Gemma's aunt, was a different case. She was 62, and she had come to the Christmas gathering each year as the senior member of Gemma's family. She was self-possessed in the particular way of women who have spent a long time managing other people's perceptions of them. She had come to dinner at my house once, in the second year after Elspeth died, when Lachlan had briefly experimented with the idea of alternating locations. During that dinner, Patricia had broken one of Elspeth's cups, a small white porcelain cup, part of a set that Elspeth had loved, and that I had kept on the open shelf above the kitchen bench because it seemed wrong to put them in a cupboard where they would not be seen. Patricia had knocked the cup from the shelf reaching for something, and it had broken cleanly in two on the kitchen floor. She had been mortified. Her face had gone through several things very quickly: shock, embarrassment, and then a kind of controlled social management in which she said she was so sorry and offered to replace it. And I told her it was absolutely fine, and she visibly did not believe me. She had never mentioned the cup again. I suspected she thought about it. People who are embarrassed by accidents they cannot undo tend to either avoid the subject with careful thoroughness or bring it up preemptively to diffuse it. Patricia had chosen avoidance. She had been perfectly correct with me at every subsequent gathering, but there was a quality of tension in her correctness that told me the cup was still somewhere in her mind. I found a cup at the market in Norwood Parade. Not the same pattern. I would not have had any way to find the same pattern, but a similar white porcelain cup with a simple band of deep blue at the rim. Plain and elegant. I wrapped it in tissue inside the craft paper. I wrote a card. The card said, "A person should not be defined by a small accident, especially when the person responded to it with such genuine feeling. You broke nothing that mattered more than a cup. What you showed in that moment mattered considerably more than the cup. I hope you know that. R." And then there was the last box, the one with no name on it. I had been thinking about the letters for 2 years. Not all of them, 13 specific ones, in their envelopes, in the wooden pencil box on the shelf in the study, each one addressed to Lachlan in Elspeth's handwriting. She had written them across the last 5 Christmases of her life, one per year, and in the years she was ill, she had continued writing them even when writing had become physically difficult, because she considered them important, and she was not a woman who abandoned important things. I had tried to give them to him, not all at once at a time. But Lachlan in those years had been busy in the particular way of someone who is managing the grief of losing a parent by managing everything else as thoroughly as possible. He would arrive late at family gatherings. He would leave early for work commitments that sometimes were real and sometimes were the kind of commitment a person creates when they need an exit. When I had said on one occasion that I had a letter from his mother for him, he had said yes, great, he would take it next time. The next time came and I had the letter and he forgot about it. After a while, I stopped trying to time the handoff and started simply keeping them because they were hers and they were his, and the timing was not yet right in the way she had meant that phrase. Now, wrapping the last box in the December kitchen with the heat of Adelaide pressing against the windows and the lemon tree going about its business in the back garden, I thought that the timing had arrived. Not as a weapon. I need you to understand this because it would be easy to read what I did as calculated cruelty, as a performance of superiority, as the revenge of a father humiliated by a note in blue pen. It was none of those things. I wrapped those 13 letters in the last box because they belonged to him, and they had always belonged to him, and whatever he did with the information they contained was his own business. I was simply returning what was his. I added nothing to the box. No card from me, no R at the bottom of anything. Just 13 envelopes in Elspeth's handwriting, held together with the same pale yellow ribbon she had tied around them the year she organized the cedar chest and knew she was running out of time. I set all 5 packages in a cloth shopping bag. I put the shopping bag by the front door. I made dinner. Something simple, leftover rice and a few things from the fridge, and ate at the kitchen table with the radio on low. A program about birds of the South Australian coast that I had been meaning to listen to for weeks. The presenter had a slow, careful voice that suited the subject. I washed the dishes. I sat on the veranda in the evening heat for a while. The street was quiet, the way suburban streets become quiet after the school holidays begin and the neighborhood settles into its summer rhythm. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and I slept which surprised me slightly. I had expected to lie awake with the kind of churning that accompanies decisions you are not certain of, but the decision did not feel uncertain. It felt like the only honest next step, which tends to produce a clearer conscience than more complicated choices. Christmas Eve arrived with the particular quality of a December morning in Adelaide that has been warm overnight and shows no sign of apologizing for it. I had my tea on the veranda. I watched a magpie work its way along the guttering of the house across the street with professional thoroughness. I read the newspaper for longer than I usually did, which was my way of giving myself space before the practical part of the day. At 4:30 in the afternoon, I put the shopping bag in the car. I put the Pantone in a separate bag because the note had said to bring gifts, and the Pantone did not feel like a gift in the formal sense, but rather the kind of thing you bring to a table. And since I was not going to be at the table, it seemed slightly absurd to bring it. I left the Pantone on the kitchen bench. I drove out to Glenelg North along the coast road because I preferred the coast road in December, the quality of the light over the Gulf in late afternoon, the particular blue of the water that never looked quite the same twice. I arrived in Seaview Road at 6:15. The house was lit up. Through the front window, I could see movement, adults in the living room, Gemma moving across the kitchen space beyond, Simon visible on the back deck through the glass sliding doors that connected the open-plan interior to the outdoor area. I did not go to the front door. I went to the side gate, which was unlocked, as it usually was, and carried the shopping bag around to the back entrance. I could hear them before I reached the deck. Conversation and laughter, and the particular sound of an occasion going well, the ice in a glass, the particular note of multiple people talking across each other comfortably. Gemma saw me first through the kitchen window. Her expression was a very small and carefully controlled surprise, followed immediately by the correct social response, a smile, a step toward the door. She opened the back door and said, "Rowan, you're here." I said, "Not for long. I just wanted to drop these off." I held up the shopping bag. She looked at the bag and then at me, and something moved in her expression that I could not fully read in the fraction of a second it occupied. "Come in," she said. "I won't," I said. "But thank you." Lachlan had appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had a glass of white wine and a slightly flushed appearance that suggested the evening had been pleasantly underway for some time. He looked at me. I looked at him. I have replayed that moment a number of times since then, and I have never been entirely sure what was in his expression. Something complex. Something that knew. "Dad," he said. "Lachlan," I said, "Merry Christmas." I set the bag on the outdoor table and took out each package one at a time, placing them in a row. I named none of them. The names were on the small cards tucked under the ribbon of each one. Meredith and Simon had come to the door now. Patricia was behind them. I gave Meredith a quick embrace. I shook Simon's hand. I nodded to Patricia and told her it was good to see her. I did not look at Lachlan again for longer than a moment. There was nothing left to transact. "Enjoy your evening," I said. "The food looks wonderful." I walked back along the side of the house and out through the gate and got into my car on Seaview Road and drove back along the coast road in the last of the December light. The Gulf going from blue to orange to a dark that came in from the south, and I drove home to Edmund Street and parked the car in the driveway and went inside and heated the Pantone in the oven for 15 minutes, which is not how Pantone is traditionally served, but which made the house smell of vanilla and candied fruit and something warm. and I ate it at the kitchen table with a cup of strong tea and listened to the evening settle around the house. At midnight, when the night had reached its quiet center and the suburb was as still as it ever gets in summer, I thought about them opening the boxes. I thought about Lachlan's hands on the bottle opener, the particular moment of recognition. I thought about Gemma unfolding the letter in Elspeth's handwriting, reading the words intended for her years ago by a woman she had quietly turned into an inconvenient memory. I thought about Meredith holding the blue notebook and reading the first page and understanding exactly what was being said. I thought about the last box, the one with no name, being passed between them with uncertainty before someone understood who it was for. I thought about Lachlan holding the 13 envelopes. I thought about him reading his mother's handwriting on the outside of the first one. I thought about what happens in a person when something they put aside for later is returned to them at exactly the moment they are least prepared and most in need of it. I did not think about any of this with satisfaction. I thought about it with the particular feeling of someone who has done an honest thing and cannot know what the honest thing will produce, only that it was honest and therefore the most correct available option. The lemon tree in the back garden was invisible in the dark, but I knew it was there. That has always been enough. The morning of Christmas Day in Adelaide arrives with a particular quality of light that I have always found difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. It is not the soft, forgiving light of a winter Christmas. It is direct and clear and entirely without the atmospheric blur that cold air produces in other parts of the world. By 6:30, the sun is already doing serious work, and the shadows are the sharp kind, the kind that tell you exactly what time it is and exactly where everything stands in relation to everything else. I was on the veranda with my tea before the street had properly woken up. A neighbor's car was already gone from the driveway, someone who had family in the hills and always left early on Christmas morning to beat the traffic on the Torrens Valley Road. A pair of rainbow lorikeets were making an absolute production of the bottle brush at the end of the front path. The heat was already present, not punishing yet, but established. The way a guest who will become difficult announces themselves early with perfect correctness. I had slept again. 6 hours, which was more than I expected and more than I deserved in the particular accounting that a sleepless conscience applies to itself. I had woken once at around 3 in the morning with the specific disorientation of a person who cannot immediately remember why the previous day was significant, and then the weight of it had returned, and I had lain in the darkness for perhaps 20 minutes before sleep took me again, which I attributed less to peace of mind and more to the simple physical fact of being 57 years old and having spent the previous afternoon in emotional labor that does not look like physical exertion, but costs the same amount of energy. I was on my second cup of tea when I heard the car. I knew it was Lachlan's car before I saw it. He drives a large silver vehicle of a make that produces a particular sound at low speed on a residential street. A sound of considered engineering, not aggressive, but present. He parked in front of the house on Edmund Street in a manner that suggested he had done so without planning it, the car slightly askew from the curb, which was unlike him. Lachlan usually parked with precision. He sat in the car for what I estimated was 3 minutes before getting out. I watched this without moving from the veranda chair. I was aware that I was watching, and that he would see me watching when he turned toward the house, and I made no adjustment to my position. I did not go inside. I did not stand. I sat with my tea and waited. He came through the front gate and up the path and stopped at the bottom of the veranda steps. He was wearing the same clothes from the previous evening, which told me he had come here before going home or before sleeping, which told me the drive from Glenelg North to Norwood had been a decision made in the late hours of Christmas Eve or the early hours of Christmas morning. Not a considered plan, but something that had simply needed to happen. He was holding the note, the small folded square of paper, his own handwriting, blue fine-tip pen. He was holding it between his thumb and forefinger in a way that looked involuntary, the way you hold something that you want to put down but have not yet found a place for. I looked at it. I looked at him. I said, "Good morning." He said, "I need to say something." I said, "All right." He stood at the bottom of the steps. He looked older than 35 in that light. Or perhaps more accurately, he looked the age he was, rather than the slightly younger age his professional confidence usually projected. His face had the specific quality of a person who has been awake for a long time with a particular thought, and who has arrived somewhere with that thought still running. "I want to give this back to you," he said, and he held out the note. I looked at it for a moment. Then I said, "Keep it." His hand stayed extended. He had not expected that. "I don't want it," he said. "I know," I said. "Keep it anyway." He lowered his hand slowly. He looked at the note in his palm. I watched him understand that I was not going to take it from him, and that therefore he was going to have to carry it home, and I watched him understand what that meant. "Sit down if you like," I said. "There's tea." He came up the steps and sat in the other veranda chair, the one that had been Elspeth's preferred chair for the 22 years we had lived in this house, the one with the slightly different angle that she had found better for the evening light. He sat in it with the particular unconsciousness of a person whose childhood has made certain chairs unremarkable by familiarity. He had sat in that chair hundreds of times. He had sat in it as a child doing homework with a book on his knees. He had sat in it as a young man during conversations about his future that he had found tedious at the time, and that I now suspected he thought about with a different quality of attention. I went inside and got another cup. I poured tea. I brought it to him. He took it with both hands. For a while, we did not speak. The lorikeets finished their argument with the bottle brush and relocated to someone else's garden. The heat continued its steady arrival. A car went past on Edmund Street without slowing. The suburb was waking up in its particular Christmas morning way, which in Adelaide involves lawn sprinklers and distant sounds of gatherings assembling themselves, and the occasional burst of music from a backyard that has started its party earlier than is strictly conventional. Then Lachlan said, "I read the letters." I did not say anything. "Not all of them," he said. "3. I read 3. I waited." "She wrote about the barbecue at the apartment in Prospect," he said. "In the one from that year. She wrote about how you drove all the way across the city at 7 in the morning to help me set up and didn't mention it to anyone, and just did it." I had forgotten about that morning. It came back to me in a way that memories from that period did, with the particular clarity of a time that had been lit differently. The way the years when Elspeth was fully herself were lit. I had driven over because he had called the previous evening in a state of mild organizational panic about whether the outdoor table would hold the weight he intended for it. And I had looked at my watch and calculated the drive time and said I would be there at 7. "She said," Lachlan continued, and his voice had the quality of a man reading from something, even though he did not have the letter in his hands, "that she thought it was the most characteristic thing about you, that you would do the thing that needed doing without requiring anyone to know you had done it." I watched a wood pigeon land on the fence at the end of the front path and consider the garden with the mild, unfocused attention of a bird that has nowhere specific to be. She also said, he said, that she worried I was learning to confuse success with distance. He paused. She said it gently. But she said it. I said, she said most things gently. It didn't make them less accurate. He put the cup down on the railing. He still had the note in his other hand. He looked at it with something that was not a straightforward expression, something that had several layers operating simultaneously. I don't remember writing this, he said. I considered that. Do you mean you wrote it without thinking? I mean, it didn't feel like something I was deciding, he said. It felt like something I was solving, a logistics problem. I know, I said. That was the most accurate part of it. He looked at me then, properly. I need to tell you about the last 2 years, I said, not to go over the ledger, not to establish blame, but because you were there and you saw it, and I think you knew more than you admitted to yourself, and I think it would be useful for both of us if I said it plainly. He nodded once. It was a specific kind of nod, the nod of a person bracing. I told him about the toasts, not dramatically, simply, that his mother's name had stopped being spoken at the table in his house, and that this was not something that had happened by accident or through oversight, and that I had understood the reason and had chosen, for too long, to accommodate it because accommodation had seemed like the path that would allow me to remain present in his life. I told him about the small corrections, the suggestion about my clothes, the glance exchanged when my stories ran long, the year he had replaced the Saya location without consulting me, and I had said nothing. The gradual rearrangement of myself into someone smaller and less inconvenient. I told him about the afternoon I had stood outside his house looking at the beautiful people in the beautiful room and felt genuinely uncertain whether my presence added anything to the architecture of his life or whether it was simply a load the structure was being asked to carry without adjustment. I told him none of this loudly. I told it the way I had always been accused of doing things quietly and without requiring an audience. He listened. To his credit, he did not interrupt. He did not offer defenses. He sat in his mother's chair in the Christmas morning heat with the cup of tea and the folded note, and he listened to his father describe the last 2 years in the plain language of a man who had decided that honesty was the appropriate material for the situation. When I was done, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the necessary thing and are now living in the space where that necessary thing exists. Lachlan said, I didn't think of it as pushing you out. I know, I said. That's the part that took me a while to properly understand. It was something that happened in the space between intention and effect. Those are sometimes very different locations. Gemma, he started. Gemma is not the reason, I said. Gemma is a person making the choices available to her. You are a person who allowed those choices to become the shape of your family. That is a different thing. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, She read the letter. The one Mum wrote her. I thought she might. She didn't say anything to me at first. She just went into the kitchen and started washing things that were already clean. He paused. She does that when something has gotten to her. I thought about Elspeth's letter to Gemma, about the sentence, I think you are more than adequate. I thought about what it would be like to receive that letter a decade late, from the hands of the man whose father you had quietly reduced to a delivery function, written by the woman whose memory you had quietly moved to the edges of the table. Your mother believed in people before they had earned it, I said. It was one of her most expensive qualities. Expensive for her, I mean. She paid for it in the assumptions she sometimes got wrong, but she also got right things that more cautious people would have missed. She was right about Gemma, Lachlan said. Yes, I said. And about me? I looked at my son, 35 years old, holding a note in his own handwriting, sitting in his dead mother's chair on Christmas morning, asking whether his mother had been right about him. I thought about 13 envelopes with pale yellow ribbon. I thought about a woman in her last years writing down, one Christmas at a time, the things she saw in her son that she most wanted him to understand about himself. Read the other 10 letters, I said, then come back and ask me that. He did not argue with this. He picked up his cup again. We sat for another 20 minutes. We talked about nothing important. The lorikeets returned. A neighbor walked past with a dog and called out Merry Christmas, and I called it back. Lachlan drank his tea. The heat continued its professional ascent. Before he left, I said one more thing. I said it standing at the top of the veranda steps, and I said it without anger, which I want you to understand required some effort. Not because the anger was overwhelming, but because the effort of not performing it was itself a form of work. I said, I will continue to love this family. I want you to know that clearly, but I will not continue to come to a table where my presence is a favor being extended to me rather than something wanted. I am 57 years old, and I have been building things my whole life. I know the difference between a load-bearing element and a decorative one. I am not going to spend whatever time I have left being decorative. Lachlan stood on the path below the steps and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, I know. And then he left. And the silver car pulled away from the curb and went back up Edmund Street toward the main road. And I watched it go. And then I went inside and washed the 2 cups and stood in the kitchen for a while with my hands on the edge of the sink, feeling the particular texture of a morning that had said everything it needed to say. I want to pause here for just a second, because what I have been describing and what I am about to describe is the kind of thing that takes a long time to become a story you can tell clearly. For a long time, it was just something that had happened to me, something I was inside rather than something I could see the shape of. If any of this is landing somewhere in you as you listen, I hope you will tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Your city, your state, your part of the world. I read every single one. And if it is the kind of night where you found this because something needed to be heard, leave a like and subscribe because there is something new here every day. I appreciate you being in this with me. Let me keep going because there is more and the more matters. Meredith came that afternoon, not with Simon, which was itself a statement, though a gentle one. She came alone, in her own car, and she knocked at the front door rather than coming around the back, which was her particular way of signaling that she was arriving as a visitor rather than as the daughter who knew the house. I noticed these things about Meredith. I always had. She was 38, and she looked like her mother in the specific way that daughters sometimes resemble a parent, not in the surface details of the face, so much as in the quality of attention she brought into a room. She had Elspeth's way of listening, the complete physical orientation toward whoever was speaking that made you feel your words were being received rather than merely heard. She sat at the kitchen table, and I made more tea, and we talked for 2 hours. She told me about the previous evening in a way that was specific and honest, and that I suspected had cost her something to organize into words. She told me about the room when the presents were being opened, the way the conversation had slowed and then stopped, the way Gemma's hand had gone still on the wrapping paper. She told me about Lachlan picking up the bottle opener and turning it over in his hands and saying nothing for almost a full minute. She told me about Patricia reading her card and looking up with an expression that she described as a person being caught in a private moment by a mirror they had not seen. And then she told me about herself. I opened the notebook, she said, and I read the first page. I waited. I sat in the bathroom with it for about 10 minutes, she said, because I needed somewhere to read it where I could just feel what I felt without anyone seeing my face. I said, "That sounds right." "I've been neutral for 3 years," she said, "because I thought being neutral was the thing that would preserve the most. The family, the relationships, the peace." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "But what you wrote was right. Neutrality is a language, and the message it sends is that what is happening is acceptable. I didn't write it to condemn you," I said. "I know," she said. "That was the hardest part to read. If you had written it in anger, it would have been easier to put down. But you wrote it as a fact, as something you had simply noticed. And somehow a fact noticed quietly is more difficult than an accusation shouted." I thought about Elspeth saying something similar once about her own approach to students who had disappointed her. She had said that the most effective thing was never the raised voice. The most effective thing was the quiet, specific statement of what was true. "What are you going to write in it?" I asked, meaning the notebook. Meredith looked at me with something that was almost a smile. "I don't know yet, but I've been thinking about all the things I saw in the last 3 years that I made myself not respond to, and I think there might be quite a few pages of it." "There's no deadline," I said. "No," she said, "but I don't think I want to wait as long as I've been waiting." She left at 4:30. She embraced me at the front door in the particular way she embraced me, holding on slightly longer than a casual embrace requires. I stood on the veranda and watched her car disappear around the corner, and then I stood there for a while, in the afternoon heat, which had peaked and was now beginning its slow concession to the evening. Noel arrived at 6, with a leg of lamb in a baking dish covered with foil, and a bottle of McLaren Vale Shiraz, and the specific expression of a man who has been informed of the broad outline of a situation and has decided that what is required is good food and good wine rather than extensive commentary. He knew me well enough to understand that the commentary, if it was wanted, would be solicited, and that his job tonight was to be present rather than analytical. We cooked together in the kitchen the way we had cooked together many times, comfortably and without elaborate coordination, each moving around the other in the small space with the ease of long practice. The lamb went into the oven with rosemary from the garden. Noel opened the Shiraz and poured 2 glasses and set them on the kitchen bench. I made a salad from the garden, tomatoes and cucumber and the last of the basil, and we set the table in the back garden under the lemon tree because the evening was warm and the sky was doing its best December work above us, a deep blue still holding light in the south. We ate and we talked, not about Lachlan, not primarily. We talked about the river, about a walking trail Noel had done in the Flinders Ranges the previous month, about a book I had been reading about the early settlement of South Australia, the specific physical challenges of building in that climate with those materials, and that understanding of what the land would and would not accept. Noel told a story about a former student of his who had sent him a letter out of nowhere, 15 years after finishing school, to say that something Noel had said in a classroom in the 1990s had turned out to be useful. We talked about whether impact is always visible when it happens, or whether it sometimes moves underground and surfaces years later in forms you would not predict. We talked about Elspeth. That was the Christmas gift I gave myself. the space to talk about her without watching anyone's expression for signs of discomfort. Noel had known her for over 20 years. He had specific memories that I did not have. Things she had said at parties I had not attended. A conversation they had had once on a drive that she had apparently found very clarifying about a professional decision she was facing. He told me things I had not known. I told him things he had not known. We sat under the lemon tree in the warm December dark and remembered her in the way that people who loved the same person remember them when there is no pressure to perform the remembering correctly. At some point in the evening, perhaps at 8:30, with the lamp from the kitchen casting its particular light out through the window onto the garden, I told Noel about the note. Not the packages or the letters or the morning visit from Lachlan, just the note. I read it to him from memory, which was not difficult because those particular words had been extremely efficiently stored. Noel was quiet for a moment after I said it. Then he said, "What did you do with the note?" I said I gave it back to him. He tried to return it. I told him to keep it. Noel nodded slowly. He turned his glass once in his hand, the way he did when he was thinking something through carefully before he spoke. "That's exactly right," he said. "I thought so," I said. "A man needs to carry the things he has done," Noel said. "Not as punishment, as information." We finished the wine. We washed the dishes. Noel left at 10, and I walked him to the front gate, and we shook hands in the way we had shaken hands at the end of evenings for 20 years. A firm grip with slightly longer contact than a formal handshake, which was our version of what other people did with embraces. I went back inside. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked down the hall past the pencil marks on the door frame, the record of 2 children growing up in this house, and I went to the study and looked at the wooden pencil box on the shelf, which was now empty, and I felt the particular quality of a space from which something has been removed, not because it was lost, but because it was ready to be somewhere else. I put the empty box on the shelf where it had always been. I went to bed. In the weeks that followed Christmas, the family moved in the slow, careful way that families move when something significant has happened, and everyone is still working out what it means for their particular position. Lachlan did not call for 11 days. I did not find this surprising. I had given him 11 letters to read in addition to the 3 he had read on Christmas Eve, and reading your dead mother's words is not something you rush through, especially when those words are specific and honest and require you to sit with something about yourself that you have been successfully avoiding. When he did call, it was a Thursday evening. I was in the garden with a pair of secateurs and the lemon tree, which had become somewhat assertive over the summer and was beginning to crowd the path. I heard the phone through the kitchen window and went inside and answered it. He said, "I read them all." I said, "All right." He said, "I want to come over sometime. Not to talk about what happened, just to come over." I said, "Thursday evenings usually work." There was a brief pause. Then he said, "Noel's Thursday?" "Noel comes every second week," I said. "There are plenty of other Thursdays." Another pause. Then, "Next Thursday?" I said, "I'll have something in the house to eat." He said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." He came the following Thursday at 6:30, and we sat in the garden, and I made dinner, grilled fish and salad, nothing elaborate, and we talked for 2 hours. Not about the letters, not directly, not about the Christmas. We talked about a property development he was working on in Henley Beach and about a structural question he had about the site that he wanted my opinion on. And I gave it, and we talked about the engineering of the seawall, and about the particular challenges of building close to the coast in a climate that was changing in ways that required different load assumptions than the ones that had been standard 20 years ago. It was, on the surface, a perfectly ordinary conversation between a father and a son who share a professional background. Underneath it was something else. Underneath it was the slow, patient, specific work of rebuilding something that had been allowed to become too light to bear weight. Gemma called me the following week, not on a Thursday, on a Tuesday afternoon when I was reading on the veranda and the phone vibrated on the table beside me. I looked at her name on the screen for a moment before answering. She said, "I've been thinking about what to say for a while." I said, "You don't have to say anything specific." "I do, though," she said. "I've been thinking about the letter, the one she wrote for me." I waited. "She said she thought I was more than adequate," Gemma said. "And what I keep thinking about is how often I had to tell myself that very same thing, and how different it is to have someone else say it." I said, "She meant it." "I know," Gemma said. "That's the thing. Reading her handwriting, I know she meant it. And then I think about how I spent the last 3 years treating her memory like something that needed to be managed. And I feel like I owe both of you an apology that I'm not sure I have the right words for yet." "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "You owe it some thought. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I know how to do Christmas the way your family does it," she said. "That's all right," I said. "Nobody is born knowing how. Elspeth learned it from her own family and then made it her own. You can do the same." "Will you?" she started, and then stopped. "Will I what?" I said. "Will you tell me about some of it?" she said. "The way it worked. Before." I thought about that for a moment. The sound of the cicadas was starting up in the she-oak at the corner, the afternoon heat arriving in its usual professional manner. "Come for tea sometime," I said. "I'll tell you about it." She said she would, and she did, 3 weeks later on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat in the back garden with cold drinks because the heat was still significant, and I told her about Elspeth's tradition, the letters, the specific rather than the generic, the things she had noticed in each person rather than the thing expected to be said. I told her what Elspeth had believed about attention, that it was the most valuable thing one person could give another, more valuable than money or praise or time alone, that the specific quality of being truly noticed by someone who chose to notice you was the closest thing to grace that most people encountered in ordinary life. Gemma listened to this the way Lachlan had not always listened to things, completely and without framing what she was going to say next. I noticed this about her. I wondered if Elspeth had noticed it too, and I thought that she probably had, because Elspeth noticed the things that were hidden under the things that were visible. In February, Meredith gave me the first letter, not the notebook, but a letter written on plain paper in her own handwriting, folded and placed in an envelope with my name on the front. She left it on the veranda table one morning when she stopped by without calling ahead, which was a new thing for her, the stopping by, and I found it there with my morning tea. I read it inside at the kitchen table. It was 3 pages. It said the things she had seen and not responded to. It said them without drama and without excessive self-condemnation, in the measured, careful language of someone who has thought about something for a long time before writing it down. It said that she had understood, reading my card on Christmas Eve, that silence is not the same as neutrality, and that she had been confusing the two for long enough that the confusion had become comfortable. It said that she missed her mother with a ferocity that she had been keeping very quiet for 3 years because it had seemed like the family needed her to be the stable one, and that being the stable one had required a certain compression of herself that she was now beginning to examine. The last paragraph said, "I want to write the letter this year. The Christmas letter. I know I am not as good at it as Mum was, but I think trying is the point. If you will help me understand what she was looking for in a person when she was deciding what to notice, I think I can find it. I think I have always known how to see. I just stopped trusting what I saw. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in the wooden pencil box on the study shelf, which had been empty since Christmas. It was the first thing I had put into it since returning Elspeth's letters to their rightful place. I want to stop for a moment here because I realize I have been giving you a great deal, and I want to make sure you are still with me. If you are watching this from somewhere across the country or the world right now, drop your city or state in the comments. I genuinely want to know who is in this with me. And if you know someone who has been carrying something similar, a father who has been quietly moved to the outside of a family table, a parent who has become logistical in the eyes of someone they raised, please share this with them. Sometimes a person needs to hear something that names the thing they have been living without knowing what to call it. Subscribe if you have not. There is a new story here every single day. Now let me tell you about the summer that followed and what it meant for the question I had been carrying since Elspeth left. There is something Elspeth used to say about time that I have been thinking about for the past several months. She said that time does not heal things in the way the phrase suggests, as if the healing is passive, as if you simply need to wait long enough and the wound closes itself. What actually happens, she said, is that the person heals. The person does the work of healing. Time is simply the medium in which that work takes place. The way water is the medium in which a fish moves, necessary but not itself, the agent of anything. I have thought about this a great deal in the months that followed Christmas, about what the work of healing actually requires, in practical terms, in the specific and daily terms of a family that is reassembling itself around a new understanding of what it is. There is no dramatic version of this reassembly. There is no scene where all the misunderstanding resolves at once and everyone embraces and the music swells. What there is, instead, is a series of Thursday evenings, a sequence of phone calls that are slightly more honest than the ones that preceded them. A Saturday afternoon in a garden with cold drinks and a conversation about what attention means. A letter found on a veranda table. A notebook with one page filled in and all the others waiting. By April, Lachlan was coming most Thursdays. Not everyone. Sometimes work kept him. Sometimes Gemma had an evening she wanted him for. But most Thursdays he arrived at 6:30, and we sat in the back garden or in the kitchen depending on the weather, and we talked. And occasionally he brought wine, and occasionally I had made something, and we ate together at the kitchen table where I had eaten alone for nearly 3 years. The Thursday evenings had begun in February as cautious things. We moved around each other with the care of people who know where the bruises are and are trying not to apply pressure unnecessarily. We talked about work, about the city, about a documentary series I had been watching about the construction of significant engineering projects in places with difficult climates, which interested us both and provided the kind of comfortable professional common ground that men of different generations sometimes use as a bridge over the more personal water. By March, the evenings had become more direct. Lachlan had finished the letters by then. He told me this on a Thursday evening with the back garden lit by the lamp from the kitchen and the sound of the neighbor's sprinkler system running its evening cycle. He said he had read the last one twice. He said it was the one from the year of the barbecue, and that it was, of all the things his mother had written to him over those 5 years, the most precise description of himself he had ever read. Precise in both the good qualities she saw and the specific concern she held with such care alongside the good qualities, not as a counterweight, but as a companion observation, the way a good structural assessment notes both what is working and what needs monitoring. I asked him what she had seen most clearly. He was quiet for a moment. The sprinkler continued its rotation. A bat went overhead against the last of the April sky, the brief winter dusk of a city that is never entirely dark. He said, "She said she thought I had inherited your capacity for building things that last, but that I had not yet learned to distinguish between the things that last because they were made with care, and the things that are simply maintained because it costs too much to admit they have not been built properly." I said nothing. "She was talking about me professionally," he said. "But she also wasn't." "No," I said. "She usually wasn't only talking about one thing at once." "She said she thought the next decade would be when I learned the difference," he said, "and that she hoped she would be there to see it." He stopped. The sprinkler finished its cycle. The garden was very quiet for a moment. "She wasn't," he said. "No," I said. He looked at his glass. "But I think she knew you would be." I have replayed that sentence many times since April. I have replayed it in the particular way you replay something that arrives in a form you were not expecting, and that lands in a place that was not fully defended. It was not a dramatic sentence. He said it quietly and without performance, and then he drank his wine and looked at the garden, and we moved on to other subjects. But it was the sentence that told me something true about where we were and about what the work of rebuilding was actually producing. In May, I attended a gathering at Lachlan and Gemma's house in Glenelg North. Not a SIA, not a formal occasion, a barbecue on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of thing that families in Adelaide do in autumn when the heat has moderated to something pleasurable and the outdoor spaces are finally usable in the middle of the day without requiring shade structures and a great deal of water. I arrived at 12:15. I came through the front door, which Lachlan opened, and not the side gate, which I had used in December. I noted this without saying anything about it. I did not think it required comment. Some things are better received when they are simply allowed to be what they are. Gemma met me in the entrance hall. She was wearing a green dress and her hair was different from the last time I had seen her. And she looked, in that particular afternoon light, genuinely comfortable in her own house in a way that I thought I had not seen before, or perhaps had not been positioned to observe. She said my name and kissed my cheek, which was the first time she had done that in at least 2 years, and I said it was good to see her and meant it. The afternoon was easy. Meredith and Simon were there. Patricia had come down from wherever she had been spending autumn, and she embraced me when I arrived with the specific quality of a person who has been carrying something and is relieved to put it down. I told her it was good to see her. She said, with a precision I had not expected from her, that she had read my card 3 times, and that she had thought about it at length, and that she thought I was a kind man. I said I thought she was a kind woman. She said, "We could have been better friends." I said, "We could still be." She looked at me with the particular expression of a person receiving a piece of information that they were not certain they had earned. Then she smiled, a genuine one. Not the social management smile, but the other kind. We ate outside. Lachlan grilled. Simon opened wine with the new tape measure clipped to his belt loop, which was not its intended purpose, but which he had adopted as a kind of running joke that had started when Meredith had pointed out that he was wearing it to a social occasion, and he had said he always wore it because you never knew when something needed measuring. There was a quality of ease to the afternoon that I recognized as something I had not experienced in that particular family combination for a long time. The ease of people who have been honest with each other about something difficult and who are now finding out what the relationship looks like on the other side of that honesty. After the meal, Gemma and I sat for a while at the garden table while the others moved around the yard. She had a glass of sparkling water. I had the last of the wine. The afternoon light was the specific autumn light of Adelaide in May, warm without the summer's insistence, a more considered version of itself. She said, "I want to try the letters this year." I looked at her. "For Christmas," she said. "Not instead of presents, but as well. The way Elspeth did." "Have you talked to Lachlan about it?" I asked. "He suggested it," she said. "He said it seemed like the right thing to continue." I thought about that. My son, who had treated those letters as sentimentalism for 3 years, suggesting that the tradition be continued. I thought about what 13 letters from his dead mother had produced in him over the course of 5 months of Thursday evenings and careful rereading, and I thought that Elspeth, who had written them with exactly this kind of long-term effect in mind, would have been entirely unsurprised. "What do you write about?" Gemma asked. "How do you know what to choose?" "You write about something specific," I said. "Not a general quality, not a compliment. Something specific that happened, that you saw, that meant something. The more specific, the better." That was what she believed. That the general thing, "you are kind, you are generous," is too easy to receive and too easy to set aside. The specific thing, the time you did this particular thing on this particular day, requires the person to actually receive it as a fact rather than a courtesy. Gemma was quiet for a moment. "That's harder," she said. "Yes," I said. "That's why it works." She looked at her water glass. "I keep thinking about what she wrote to me, the letter you gave me." She paused. "She said nobody else was saying it, that I was more than adequate, that I was trying to belong somewhere that hadn't made room." She looked up. "I wonder if I've been doing the same thing to you." I considered how to respond to that with the appropriate honesty. "You haven't made it easy," I said, "but I also didn't always make it easy to make room. I carry things in a way that takes up space even when I am trying not to. Elspeth was good at knowing which space I needed and which I was simply occupying by habit. Not everyone has that skill, and it is not reasonable to expect it," Gemma said. "I want to learn it." I said, "Then you will." There is something I want to say before I tell you what happened in the months leading up to the Christmas that followed, and I want to say it directly, because I think it is the part of this story that matters most in the large sense, the sense that goes beyond this particular family in this particular suburb of this particular city. What I have been describing is not a reversal. It is not a story that ends with everything restored to what it was. The family before Elspeth died is not available anymore. It has not been available since the morning of the 14th of March 3 years ago, when a woman who was the most specific and attentive person I have ever known stopped being available for comment. What has been built since that morning is something different. It is constructed from different materials with different tolerances, and it will bear different loads than the original structure. This is not a loss disguised as a gain. This is simply the honest description of what building looks like when you are working with what you have rather than what you wish you had. A structural engineer understands this before almost anything else. You work with the existing conditions. You read the site carefully. You design for what the ground will actually support, not for the ideal site that exists only in the blueprint stage. The family I now have is a family that has been honest with itself about something genuinely difficult. The honesty was painful, and it was not instantaneous, and it is not complete. Meredith is still learning to speak when she sees something. Lachlan is still learning to distinguish between the surfaces he manages and the structures beneath them. Gemma is still learning the specific quality of attention that transforms courtesy into real warmth. I am still learning to speak before accommodation becomes invisibility. We are all, in other words, still learning, which is the most honest thing I can say about any of us, and which Elspeth would have recognized as the only acceptable answer to the question of how a family is doing. Let me tell you about the second Christmas. Let me stop right here for a moment. If you have stayed with this story all the way to this point, I want you to know that means something to me. Drop your city or state in the comments below. Whatever part of the world you are in right now, I want to picture you there. And if this story has touched something that needed touching, hit the like button and subscribe, because there is a new story every single day on this channel. Now let me tell you about the following December, and about the table that was set, and about who came to sit at it. And if you have never been in any of these positions, if this story has simply been the story of a family in a suburb of Adelaide in the Australian summer, and the question of what a man does when his son reduces him to a logistical function in a blue ink note, I want to say this. Pay attention to the people who are paying attention to you. Notice the specific acts of sustained presence in your life. The Knowles who come on Thursdays, the Merediths who stop by on Saturday mornings with no agenda except to sit at the kitchen table. The small particular habits of love that occur so regularly, they become invisible. Name them. Return them. Tell the person performing them what their performance means, not in general terms but specifically, with the particular memory attached. On this day, you did this thing and it meant this to me. Elspeth knew that the specific named thing is received differently than the general unnamed one. She spent her whole life demonstrating this. I am trying to spend the rest of mine continuing her demonstration. Before I give you the last image of this story, I want to ask something of you. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There is a new story here every single day, and each one is told by someone who has been through something and has found in the going through it something worth passing on. Hit the like button if this story earned it, not as a transaction, but as the specific act of acknowledgement that this story has been about. The moment when you say to something, I saw you, I received you, you mattered. Share this with someone who has been delivered to a side gate recently, someone who arrived with gifts and left before the meal, someone whose name has quietly stopped being spoken in the toasts. Those people are everywhere. They are in every family, in every suburb of every city, in every country where people build lives and love each other imperfectly and manage each other's discomfort at the cost of each other's presence. They need to hear this story. They need to know that the red envelope is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of the only conversation that matters. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you are, your city, your state. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you when you thought you might stop listening, but did not. Tell me the specific thing, if there was one, because I believe in the specific thing. Now, let me give you the last image. It is the following December. The 3rd December since Elspeth died, and the 2nd since the red envelope arrived through the letterbox on Edmund Street in the heat of an Adelaide summer. I am on the front veranda at 7:30 in the morning with my tea. The canvas shelter in the back garden is already up because Simon and Lachlan put it up yesterday afternoon and left it for today, which arrives with the exact quality of light and heat and cicada noise as the previous December and the one before it, because Adelaide in December is consistent in its commitments. There are 3 plates on the table in the back garden. Good plates, not the everyday ones, the ones with the simple cream glaze that Elspeth bought at a market in the Adelaide Hills one autumn when we had driven out for the weekend and she had stopped at a potter's stall and spent 20 minutes in conversation with the maker before deciding that these were plates worth having. They have been in the cupboard since she died, not deliberately withheld, but simply not used. The way certain things become unused in a house that has lost the person who knew best how to use them. I brought them out this morning. I set them on the trestle table under the canvas shelter with the linen napkins that Elspeth had bought in the same era, and that I had also not been using, and the glasses that catch the December light in the particular way that good glass catches light, and the bowl of sliced lemon from the tree that is once again producing beyond anyone's reasonable needs. I do not know yet who will come today. I sent the invitations in October, the letters, one to each person, written in the specific language I have been practicing for a year now, noting something I had seen in each of them, something particular and true and observed with the quality of attention that I have been trying to bring to the practice. Lachlan replied immediately. Meredith replied the following day. Gemma's reply came a week later, and it was longer than any of the previous ones. 3 paragraphs that said something specific about what the last year had meant to her, in the language of someone who has been learning to find the specific rather than relying on the general. Noel replied by simply arriving on the following Thursday with a bottle of something and saying that he would bring the lamb. Patricia said she would drive down from Clare and stay the night, which was a new thing and a good one. Simon said yes and mentioned that he was thinking of building a set of shelves in the hallway of the Prospect House and that he would bring the tape measure in case I had opinions about load-bearing implications. I set 3 plates on the table because I do not know if everyone will arrive, or if some will be delayed, or if the day will produce the particular complications that family days sometimes produce when the people in the family are still learning to be honest with each other in real time rather than in letters. 3 plates is the honest number, the number I am certain of. Myself and Noel, and the space that Elspeth still occupies at any table I set. Not as a ghost or a grief, but as the specific quality of attention that she brought to everything, and that continues to operate in this family through the people who loved her and who are learning, one December at a time, to practice what she practiced. The red envelope is in the wooden pencil box in the study. I did not throw it away. I put it in the box next to Meredith's letter and Gemma's letter and the copy of Elspeth's first letter to Lachlan, and I closed the lid. It belongs there. Not as a wound preserved, as a record of the specific moment when things were at their most reduced and the next step became unavoidable. It is the evidence of the lowest point of the load, the moment when the structure was most tested, and therefore the most important single document in the box because it is the thing from which everything else in the box proceeded. The lemon tree is visible from the veranda if I lean slightly to the right and look past the kitchen window. It is doing what it always does in December, which is to say everything it is capable of doing, unstintingly and without reservation, in the full commitment of a thing that knows its purpose and performs it without requiring acknowledgement. I have been thinking about the lemon tree for 3 years. I have pruned it and watered it in the dry months and stood under it with Noel on Thursday evenings and sat beside it in the dark in the months when the dark was the most accurate description of where I was. I have looked at it from the kitchen window on cold July mornings and on hot February afternoons and on December mornings like this one, when the light is doing its particular work on the leaves and the fruit, and the garden has the quality of something that is exactly and precisely what it is supposed to be. Elspeth planted it. Not in the sense of choosing it and digging the hole and setting the root ball in the earth. The tree was there when we arrived. It had been there for years before us. It had been producing its unreasonable quantities of fruit for people whose names we did not know, and whose December mornings had been accompanied by the same smell of citrus and eucalyptus that accompanies mine. But Elspeth claimed it in the particular way she claimed things she loved, by paying it the specific attention that transforms a thing from background into presence. She would stand under it in the evenings in the warm months and simply be there for a few minutes, looking up through the canopy at the sky, which she said she found clarifying after a day spent in rooms with ceilings. I thought of her there at the lemon tree the morning after she died. I thought of her there on the first Christmas. I think of her there most mornings now, not with the grief that was the primary quality of the first year, but with something gentler, something closer to gratitude than to loss, the specific gratitude of a person who understands that the inheritance of someone who paid genuine attention is the capacity for genuine attention, and that this capacity, practiced in the years following their absence, is the closest available continuation of what they were. I take my tea to the bottom of the back garden. I stand under the lemon tree in the December morning. The shade is imperfect, and the heat is coming, and the canvas shelter on the trestle table is waiting for whoever will sit under it today. The good plates catch the early light. The bowl of sliced lemon is on the table, and it will improve everything in proximity to it. I do not know if everyone will come, but I am not afraid of eating alone if they do not. The table is set regardless. That is the lesson of the year. The table is set regardless. On the night my son sent me a note telling me to deliver gifts and leave before dinner, he believed he was solving a logistics problem. He thought he was managing the temperature of a room. He had no way of knowing that the note would be the specific occasion his mother had been waiting for when she kept certain letters for later. He had no way of knowing that the man he was sending through the side gate was a man who had spent 31 years understanding load-bearing structures and who had been paying attention, specifically and continuously, for the entire duration of their shared life. A man can build a beautiful table and forget who held the board when it was about to fall. That was what I wrote on the card with the bottle opener. It was the most honest thing I could find to say in the space available, but here is the rest of it. The part I could not fit on a card, the part I have been telling you across the full length of this story. The board does not fall. A man who had been holding things up for a long time knows how to hold. He knows the difference between the weight that is too much and the weight that is exactly at the limit of what he can carry. He knows that the limit is not the end. It is the information. It is the moment when you understand precisely what you are carrying and precisely what you will and will not continue to hold. I set the red envelope in the wooden box. I set 3 plates on the table. I stood under the lemon tree and I was, for the first time in 3 years, completely and specifically present in my own life, in my own garden, in my own December, without the compression of accommodation, without the performance of smallness, without the particular exhaustion of a man who has been trying to fit into a space that was designed to exclude him. I was simply there, the way the lemon tree was there, doing exactly what I was made to do, producing what I had always produced, available to whoever arrived and needed what I had to give. That is the whole story. That is everything I know how to say about it. If you stayed with me through every word of this, I want to ask one final thing of you. Leave me a comment with a single word. The word is lemon. Just that word, nothing else, in the comments below. If you listen to the complete story, you already know exactly why that word. It is not a reward for finishing. It is the specific evidence that you were present. And presence, as I hope this story has demonstrated, is the most valuable thing one person can offer another. Subscribe to this channel. There is a new story every single day, told by people who have been through something and who have found in the going through it something worth the telling. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who has been delivering gifts to a side gate recently. Tell them the table is set regardless. And from my veranda in Norwood, from this old man and his lemon tree and his wooden pencil box and his 3 plates and the canvas shelter that is imperfect but does the work. From the specific quiet of an Adelaide December morning when the cicadas are beginning and the magpie is working the guttering and Elspeth's good plates are catching the first serious light of the day. Thank you. Truly. Take care of the people who notice you. Take care of the people who have been noticing you quietly for longer than you knew. Take care of each other. And set the table regardless of who you think will come, because the people who were made to be at it will find their way there. They always do.